Welcome to the fifth podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Alicia James.
Hey, and I'm Marcus Hodges, and once again, we have an outstanding visionary leader that we're going to talk to for the next 30 minutes. I am excited to introduce Jeremiah Stromberg from the state of Oregon, and we're going to jump the state of Oregon, and he has done some outstanding work, but he is a humble visionary leader, and I am really looking forward to having a conversation and for our viewers to listen to you. So we're going to jump right in. And I want you to please just introduce yourself, tell us about your experiences, and just tell us about the importance of criminal justice reform.
Well, I appreciate it, Alicia, Marcus. It's great to be back with the two of you. It's been an honor to be on other platforms with the two of you talking about these important topics. And so very excited to be a part of this. For those of you who haven't been out here to the Great Northwest, this is a beautiful time of year in Oregon. And as I was sharing, Marcus, with you before we got started, you know, it's legislative season. And this is the first legislative season for so many states in the wake of the social and racial justice issues that have occurred this last year. Mm-hmm. And so it's an exciting time to be a part of this business. It can be a little scary, a little frustrating, a little uncertain where we're going to end up with at the end of this, but definitely excited for it. You know, as far as my experiences go, what I really have to go back to, let me start with a personal story.
Yes.
When I was in college, there were 5 of us that rolled together. We did everything together, inseparable. 4 of us were white. One of our friends was black. And like many college kids, you know, we pushed the limits. This was in Southern California. We'd get out, we'd have a good time. You know, nothing that's impacted my background checks over the years to be in this business, but we definitely had our fun. And there was on one occasion, the 5 of us were in a vehicle together. And honestly, we all had an open container. And we got pulled over, and the officer walked up. He knew we were all guilty. He could see it, but he only pulled one of us out of the vehicle, and he only cited one of us with a violation, and he only threatened one of us with jail, and it wasn't the driver. And I think you can guess where I'm going with this story.
Yes.
And it was clear in that moment. That was probably the first time for me that I saw the system at play, and I started to see maybe what this privilege was about, you know, and prior to that, just being young and dumb, I was certainly naive to it. So when I fast forward 30 years, you know, I find myself now in a position where I can either support the system as it is, I can ignore it for the realities that it's not equal for everyone and find ways to justify that maybe it's really not that bad. Or I can recognize that those disparities do exist, and I'm in a position and a place now to be able to act on them.
Yes.
And you know, personally for me, it's and especially over this last year, it's been I'm choosing to act. When we're in a position of leadership, we have that ability to influence and an attempt to see improvement and to see growth, to provide transparency, to open opportunities up for change and reform. And so that's certainly where I feel I'm at these days within the system.
Wow.
Yeah, that's amazing. So, you know, I always talk about, I told Marcus this before, you know, Jeremiah is like he's like a subtle storm, right? Like he'll come in and you're going to know that change happened, but your delivery and your mannerism and, you know, your posture, I think in the season of criminal justice reform, in the season of just, you know, the evolution of your department, you know, it's impactful and it's powerful, and other thought leaders across the industry recognize your work. But I can imagine sometimes you talked about a little bit how heavy it can be in leadership. I want to just step back and say, what drives you towards the change? And you talked about a little bit about your personal experiences, but what drives you toward the change when so many leaders and people who sit in these, you know, executive positions can choose or you know, choose to act or not to act, and choose to be vocal and not to be vocal? Like what drives you to continue to make that change? And not only on the criminal justice reform element, but you also talked about racial justice. You know, you've been on APPA town halls. I mean, you've been vocal. What is your driving force for you?
Yeah, that's a great question, Alicia. You know, part of it is being in a system, having my own boss, the director of our agency, passionate for these reforms as well, and creating an opportunity for each and every one of us to engage to the level of our competency and our capability.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And that's what we really push within our team is understand and know your level of competency and where you may still have growth, and understand and know your level of capability. To what degree do you want to influence? Do you want to make a change? A couple things stand out to me when you ask me that question. Number one, as a system, especially in parole and probation, we talk about risk, need, responsivity.
Yes.
Mhm.
And risk and need is easy. We got assessments, we got our professional discretion. We can size up an individual and go, here's what the ideal case plan is and what you need to focus on. And I think too often we forget that responsivity component. And what that really means is that you're going to meet somebody where they're at and wrap them around with services that are most likely to make them successful.
That's right.
Mhm.
So you take a system like Oregon, we're predominantly white. It's the system that was predominantly supervises white people, predominantly incarcerates white people. And so it was designed for the success of white probationers, white inmates by white people. That's not bad, but what it does is it doesn't get responsive to the other 20, 25% of the population that we're serving.
Yes.
And that's the piece that for me is it was how are we going to define responsivity for everyone, not just a portion of who we're responsible to help make an impact, create opportunity and change.
Yeah.
So that was a big one for me. And second, I am very much a data driven person.
Yes, you
Yeah.
are.
I will argue with the best of them on data doesn't support it. I don't see it in the data. Show me in the data. But I've had to also learn, don't let that shut down your ability to have conversation and growth. Not everything can be captured there. But the data supports what the communities are saying, and that is there is a disparity at play here. There isn't equity in our sentencing practices, in our punitive approaches within parole and probation, in the level of responsivity for people of color compared to their white counterparts. And so when I look at the data and I see that those numbers are off, my OCD kicks in and my desire, wait a minute, we got to right size this. We've got areas of improvement. And so I think for me, yeah, it goes back to that. It's personal, it's data driven, it's evidence based. So why would we not be striving for it?
Yeah.
Jeremy, I
Yep.
think you hit the nail on the head. I mean,
Yeah.
to me, I always tell people, we talk about responsivity, and we use responsibility a lot, especially in evidence-based practices. But you tie that with equity, and people go, hold up. And I'm like, what are you holding up? They're parallel tracks. We
That's
shouldn't be
right.
holding up. We should be pushing for that. And what you're saying, what you brought up is something simple that if we just acknowledge it, we can quickly solve it. To me, it's not a big solve there, but you have to acknowledge it first. So I'm glad you brought up that responsivity and equity, because I think it's something that we all need to look at. And you brought up something else. Systems were designed for a reason, and systems were designed sometimes a long time ago to fit a certain population. As
Right.
times change, systems need to change.
That's right.
And at times we don't do that. So one thing about this fifth podcast is to empower practitioners that you can change. We have to acknowledge it, and we have to change. All right, but I'm gonna go back to your last point and the civil unrest in the state of Oregon, and it was pretty prominent across the news, the civil unrest. As a leader, how did you lead your community corrections staff through all of that was going on? You had people picking sides. You had rioting going on in Portland and other areas. How did you manage that as a leader?
Yeah, Marcus, I think Portland led the nation in the record number of nightly protests. In
Yes.
fact, they're still occurring within our city. It's always been a city of loud voices and coming out for any cause and charge. Um, and you're absolutely right. With that comes all the aspects of the situation.
Mm-hmm.
On the negative side, we have seen increased violence and destruction that disrupts and takes away from the narrative of the message. But conversely, on the other side, it really has forced an engagement by our legislature, by the criminal justice system to say, there are things that need to change. There's longstanding practices, like you were just saying, that disparately impact our BIPOC community more than our white communities.
Mm-hmm.
For me, this last year in leading, I immediately fell back on, again, sort of that data side, that research side. And what I wanted to do was find what within our span of control, within the realm of community supervision, could we focus on and be more transparent, honest, and look for ways to decrease disparity.
Yes.
And one of the things we did is we looked at more than 200,000 sanctions over the last 6 years. And we broke those sanctions out by race and by risk level. And what I wanted to look at was when similar people of similar risk levels commit similar violations, is there a similar response?
Wow.
And what we would hope is yes. And what we found is not always.
Not so much.
Not so much. And what was interesting in the data was that what we found is, and this isn't going to surprise anybody, people of color were more likely to be overridden to a little bit higher risk level, to the next level up, and therefore a little more likely to receive a jail sanction for violating behavior, and a little bit more likely to receive a longer jail sanction for those behaviors. And if you looked at any one of them by themselves, you might have been able to discount it. What's a couple days? But when we're talking hundreds of thousands of sanctions, so if I just take 20,000 sanctions and people of color are spending an average of 2 to 3 more days in jail, that's 107 years more of incarceration on those violations. 107 years by just giving 2 more days in custody than their white counterparts. So no one can tell me there's really not a difference there. What's 2 days? 2 days is 107 years. 2 days is that much longer disconnected from the community. 2 days is 2 extra days that apparently we didn't feel was so important that everyone was getting 2 more days. If the behaviors are that bad, let's at least bump everybody up to that. But that disparity level, we took a look at it and recognized we got to do something different. And I've been excited to see where so many of our probation shops have taken the data and they have said, okay, we've got to recognize, why is this occurring? Because everyone wants to say, I'm not doing it on purpose.
That's right.
And the thing is, I believe them. They're not doing it on purpose, but they're not consciously being aware of what are the little things that are playing into this. If you're risking people higher, it's going to happen. If you don't have as many other tools in your toolbox as far as culturally specific resources, connectivity to communities of color, where you can go, you know what, there is a really good program, or I know a mentor, or I think you need to get connected here. And if all you have in that toolbox is a hammer, then it doesn't matter what you're trying to do, you're going to use the hammer.
That's right.
And that's the piece that certainly within our system, we recognize we have to expand those relationships. We got to expand that toolbox. We need our officers to be more comfortable and cognizant of what's available to them as they work, especially in Oregon. Many of our rural communities have very small populations of color. But like I told my team, if we even have 10 people of color out in one of our very rural locations, that means there's 100 people of color in that community who aren't engaged in the criminal justice system, who are doing pro-social activities, who own businesses, who are willing to step up and be mentors, who are attending church, who are doing other pro-social activities. there is a connection to be made there, but we've got to put that energy in and figure out where it's at.
Wow.
Yeah. Love that. You talk about justice reform and how important it is for you to direct your team, kind of laying the lay of the land. And I remember when we first, I think it was back in Michigan, the NIC program in Michigan or the meetup in Michigan. It might have been Michigan, it might have been Tennessee. But anyway, nonetheless, we talked about justice reform initiatives and justice reinvestments across different states. And we were kind of all new to the game, and when I say new to the game, new to the idea of having specific funding allocated for probation and parole to implement reforms to try to have a reduction in recidivism directly tied to community supervision initiatives, right? And so this was kind of a double down focus, if you will. I know for Tennessee in 2016 was our big year. We were going to double down. We're going to give funding. We reshaped the model of probation and parole. We too implemented sanctions and incentives. But I think, what I'm hearing you talk about is unintentional consequences. So you implemented sanctions. The unintentional consequence was the disparity in how those sanctions were delivered. In my experience, it has been just as important for boots on the ground probation officers to understand the why and why it's so important to make those community connections, to ensure that we have wraparound services for those individuals. And it's just as important for them to know why as it is for our legislative body to know why. But one of the things that I feel that we continue as I think as a criminal justice community continue to kind of try to figure out to navigate is the importance of explaining that why to the community, right? Like why is having a day reporting center in your community not necessarily a bad thing, a negative thing? As you've navigated this criminal justice reform round one, kind of rescoping and resizing, where you are to move forward, how has the community received what you're saying? Because I'm sure they're probably like, now he said what? Did they admit fault to what? Because people's perception of government is not always that we're introspective or that, thought leaders aren't introspective. So how has the community responded to what you're saying?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I was really nervous about it, Alicia, when I first got the data, and I was like, uh-oh, a lot of people are waiting to hear the results of what we're doing around sanctioning.
Yeah.
So I threw the rest of the system under the bus right in front of me. I said, hey, we already know the criminal justice system isn't equitable, that we have overrepresentation of people of color. You get everybody nodding. And so, all right, now that we're all in agreement, here's a little area where we've got some work to do,
Right.
So there's no question. I tried to hide behind the larger system to some degree, just to at least open that door.
Yeah.
But you're absolutely right. How our officers speak to it and engage with it is so critically important. And that really plays into, for us as leaders, how you're infusing this within your offices. And let me give you an example. Just 2 days ago, and it came out of this sanctioning data. One of our small parole and probation offices started their first ever equity diversity committee. And they're
Okay.
just like, we're going to take this sanction data serious. We're going to have a group. And they only had 2 goals. One, they were going to look at what can we do to change our internal practices that might be leading to some of this disparity. And number
Right.
2, let's figure out where in our communities of color we can gain some new stakeholders, do some networking. Simple, tangible. Wasn't asking anybody to go on a personal journey around personal beliefs or anything along those lines. And sadly, I received an email from one of my officers. And what she said was that because she's been on this group, she decided to do more research into the social and racial justice unrest that's occurred this last year. And then her email took a turn and she said, I was appalled and disturbed by what I was seeing. And I've decided that I'm going to step down from this committee that I don't want to be a part of this work.
Wow.
And I thought, how sad. First, that's like if we all were sitting in a restaurant having this discussion, and I turned to the two of you and said, I see something on the menu. They got a mushroom casserole that I would never touch, so we can't eat
Yeah.
here at all. I mean, come on. There's still plenty of steak and fries to go around. There's still plenty of work to do. No one said you have to prescribe to 10 commandments of any particular group or affiliation or belief. I don't necessarily agree with everything I hear in this work. You're never going to hear me supporting defund the police,
Yes.
but that doesn't mean that I have to then say I can't be a part of work that further creates equity, further creates a responsive approach. And so that's where it's a moment like this, though. It's a moment like this where, as leaders, we get the opportunity to impact the culture within our offices, and we get to impact our officers. Because again, I have a choice. I can either go, hey, totally get it. There's some stuff I don't really like in this whole movement also, which would just reinforce our belief. I can be silent, just say, hey, thanks for the work you did, and not address it. Or third, and I haven't yet, but what I'm going to do is tell me more. Let's talk about this. You still have a responsibility to serve the population that is under our custody and control. So let's talk about what that looks like, because I sense from your email, there's a real shutdown to anything we're doing around this. I want her to explain more, to talk more. I want to look for ways where she can see where she can still be instrumental in her personal growth first, I think needs to occur.
Yeah.
And second, with the fact that you've still got an obligation and responsibility here, and we're not stopping for you. We're still moving forward. So you're absolutely right, Alicia. It's critical for our officers and our community to see that and understand that.
That I'll say this, in that story, I think that story transcend everything all across the country.
Yeah.
And it resonates to a couple things. I think people want to serve, people want to help, and then people become powerless because it becomes overwhelming. It becomes overwhelming. I don't know who this person is, but she raised her hand to be a part of it. And then
right.
she got involved and did some homework, and it became probably very overwhelming to her. Well, we have a tendency to personalize to the overwhelming because it's a big lift. And then it's easy just to shut down and think I'm powerless. And I'll say this podcast, once again, is about the empowerment of practitioners, because actually we need you. I mean, we don't have to always agree. Alicia, I don't always agree. You're not going to always agree.
Because I'm always right. And
she's always right. We're not going to always agree. But at the end of the day, what you said, if we can have a dialogue, a conversation, and find the common ground of how to do this work, we all agree on one thing. We want to make our communities better. We want to make people better. And we also acknowledge that people of color are misrepresented in the criminal justice system. You already had the data that talked about sanctions and things like that. That's going on across the country. How can we fix it? We fix it by having conversations, coming together, acknowledge it. Doesn't mean we're doing bad work. I don't think we're doing bad work, but I think systems have been created that makes us do things that when we look at them, wow, why are we doing that? But leaders have to acknowledge that. So I really, really appreciate that story that you have, which leads to me to this question. Out of all what you got going on, what is your highest mountain? What is your biggest obstacle right now? Whether it's reform, legislative, staff, what is your biggest obstacle? And what do you do on a daily basis to overcome it?
Marcus, did you ever see the movie The Incredibles?
Of course.
Pixar film?
Yes.
Elastigirl. That's the mom. If you remember, she could stretch far, and she could grab her kids, and she could grab the bad guy, and she could grab her husband. I'm feeling a bit like Elastigirl these days, when specifically, as I mentioned, going through our legislative session and through reforms, we have a responsibility to continue our partnership with prosecutors, with police, with victim advocacy groups, because we understand that public safety is important, accountability is important, and there's consequences to our behaviors. So I'm holding on to them right now on some of our reform issues and trying to get them to the table to understand that we need incentives to shorten periods of supervision, that incarceration doesn't always lead to public safety outcomes. And on the other end, I'm stretching really far to keep the advocacy groups, communities of color, those that are screaming for, we got to upend the whole system, defund, and hold on to them to say, look, we got to be able to still partner with you, and we still need you at the table. And you're right, we've done this work alone for a long time without giving you a voice, without always giving you a seat, or we placate you. We'll let you say something, but at the end of the day, we're just going to keep rolling because you don't really understand policy. You don't really understand how this plays out. We can't write that kind of language into statute and all the barriers we throw up. So I'm feeling a bit like Elastigirl, trying to hold on to both sides, because community corrections, we're right in that middle.
That's right.
We need both to be successful, and we have to have those strong partnerships and relationships. And I think as you talked about earlier, you know, we're at this increasingly divided place where you either have to subscribe into one camp or the other, and community corrections can't do that. We don't have the luxury, because we either give up a portion of public safety, or we're going to give up the stakeholders and the long-term community supports that we know play into sustainable change and behavior change well after we're gone and after an individual's point in time with the criminal justice system has passed. So that's the piece that I feel the struggle with. How do we stay connected across the spectrum? Because our work is unique in that it expands from that front end all the way to that back end. And so right now, that's the biggest challenge.
Yes.
Not to sell out to either side, sell out either side in the course of doing this work.
That is a great analogy. I always say, you know, I feel that community supervision, probation, and parole is one of the more challenging components of the criminal justice system. And, you know, serving, you know, literally on patrol, right? You go in, you restore order, you take somebody to jail or you cite them, and then you leave, right? There's not this aftermath of dealing with individuals. And so, I mean, much respect to all the police officers out there. Love that line of work. But the community corrections is like, to me, it is like we, you know, talked about before, that coaching, that redirecting when someone gets off base is not just like one and done. It is ongoing, and that can be exhausting. It can be expensive for the system if you're doing it right, if people need treatment or whatnot. And so that's just a heavy lift. So I appreciate that analogy of Elastigirl. Then you got to keep all these different, you know, like your partners, your customers. You got to keep them happy in the middle. And so very challenging system. It's very challenging. So you know, clearly, I don't know if you've noticed this, but I don't subscribe to the question list. I just kind of just ask questions as I see fit. But as we kind of draw to a close, I do want to end on a fun question. Tell me the last book you read, and what is your daily read? Like if you have a newspaper that you must read, a publication every day. Let's give our viewers those two.
Yeah, so, you know, I heard years ago that if you spend at least 15 minutes a day reading something professional,
That's right.
within 7 years, you're an expert in it. Now, I don't know about expertise, but I do subscribe to the belief that first, within this system, we have to continue to grow. We have to continue to learn. None of us have ever achieved or reached that final mark. So I subscribe to a number of publications, obviously our national ones that are put out certainly through organizations like APPA, through NIC. I take advantage of the webinars that exist. And not only for myself, but instilling that practice within my leadership team and our staff. Today, NIC sent out an article around working with veterans in prison. That's important for us in community corrections. And so I took the time to read it, to look at the stats, to understand what are the significant drivers around PTSD, what are the resources available, because that's important for us. So the first thing I would say is I definitely encourage continue professional reading, just 15 minutes a day. Get the highlights. You don't have to read 101 pages of a research meta-analysis. Just get to the conclusions. What did they find?
That's right.
Beyond that, Alicia, it's important to also separate from this work. I am all about science fiction. Ray Bradbury, when I am not doing work related, and part of it is if we had the ability to start a new world, when so much science fiction is about that ability to restart. Humanity has failed on Earth. What do we do? There's a great opportunity for hopes and dreams within that. No reason we can't do it right where we're at. But certainly if we ever colonize Mars, I think we've learned a few things while on Earth that we could do differently.
Wow. I agree with that.
Definitely. All right, Marcus. So top that. I'm gonna let you close out on that before we get Jeremiah's last word. So
I can't close out on that. Ray Bradbury science fiction. I really enjoyed the conversation, and I could talk to you all day. I really I watched you from afar. You're data driven. You're doing some good work in a tough climate.
Great.
And the one thing I love about you is there's not a conversation that you're not afraid to have with staff. And I think that's how organizations grow. So I really appreciate your leadership, appreciate all that you're doing in Oregon. I will continue to steal things from you. I'll give you credit, but I will continue to look out there to see all the good work you're doing. And we just want you to close out just to our viewers of what advice would you give practitioners doing this work? How can we keep going?
I appreciate that. Doing this work and even having these tough conversations is a lot easier when you've developed the relationships and the networking like the three of us have done. And so the fact that Alicia, you and I have worked together for many years makes it easy and comfortable that I know that we don't have to always agree. But there's strength in that. There's growth in that.
That's right.
Maybe to conclude on the same line of talking about reading, and that is, I think the next chapter in this book of criminal justice is I'm really excited to see those that are coming into the system now. So many people talk about it like, I would never go into this business today. I would never do this work now. I'm really excited for this next group that are going to replace us someday and someday soon. They're going to have a new foundation, a new perspective that we didn't have. They're going to be quicker to change and adaptability. I mean, you look at the younger generation coming up through COVID and their ability to adapt and change and learn and transition in a way that we weren't necessarily challenged with through our comfortable 70s and 80s and 90s. And so I'm excited to see where this next group of leaders takes the foundation that we've started this discussion on and the work that they're able to do with it.
Outstanding.
Definitely. Wholeheartedly agree. We thank you so much, Jeremiah. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your leadership in the industry and your willingness to have conversation and then doing the work, right? Like when the rubber meets the road, I think, you can look back at your legacy and look at your impact. And we appreciate that as your peers. So thank you to our viewers, for those who are practitioners and those who just joined us because you want to know about the practitioner's life. Like this is a great podcast to like, to share, post, tweet, text us, email us. We would love to hear from you. Thanks so much, everybody, for joining. You guys have a great day.